manage all the conflicting incentives in juvenile justice, provide effective responses to justice-involved young people, and do so in a way that's sustainable, both economically and politically. We have the problems we face today in juvenile justice. There are very few that are brand new. The only one that I think would be entirely new is the overwhelming amount of information and data and studies and reports that we all confront. Even 20 years ago, it was not that hard to keep up. And now there are so many organizations and so many people like myself constantly writing publications and developing websites and putting out videos. It's easy to get overwhelmed, and like anything with our information explosion, there's no arbiter of quality out there telling us which things are invalid on their face and which things are clearly twisted to meet another end. So the burden of our own interpretation and being consumers of information just goes up, and I don't think that's unique to juvenile justice. But the other conflicts and ongoing tensions we face have been around for well more than a century. And the central conflict is, how do we balance two very powerful forces among decision makers? One of those forces is no one wants to end up on the evening news or the front page of a paper or an investigation revealing the fact that they were the person who failed to do anything when we had a young person in custody who ended up going on to commit a serious crime. And that's risk aversion. No one wants to be that person who failed to incarcerate, failed to adjudicate, failed to commit, and then a horrible crime happens afterwards. But in trying to avoid that risk, we end up spending an enormous amount of money on programs that provide an image of security without actually addressing the fundamental problem that increases that risk. We talk a lot today about evidence-based programming and about the need for research and outcomes. But there are some things in the justice world that we still don't expose to that scrutiny. I can tell you, every time someone tries to do a study on the effects of moving a young person out of the juvenile system and into the adult system, it usually comes up either empty, having no definitive findings, or it turns out that putting a young person in the adult system seems to actually produce worse outcomes. Though that literature has been accumulating for 20, 30 years, and it still hasn't ended the practice because there are other reasons we do it. We do things in justice policy for reasons that are explicitly not about outcomes and not about public safety. We do them for that other force. No one wants to be caught being the person who let that person go. Which button? Red?
No, it's a white one. There.
My colleague and I at John Jay College in New York wrote this report a few months ago in response to conversations that have been happening around the country for a while now about mechanisms to reform juvenile justice systems. And I kept hearing people use terminology that was not clear or was confusing, or we used the same word to mean different things. And so as we started talking about this, we said, well, maybe we should name three mechanisms that we think are somewhat distinct. The boundaries between the mechanisms of resolution, reinvestment, and realignment are somewhat porous. You can't say exactly that one strategy or one state, for example, has pursued one strategy and not another, but they represent sort of the polarities. Is polarity always two? They represent the three legs of a stool, and different strategies being taken by state. And so we just wanted to describe that, and as we got into it and started sending the text around to friends and colleagues to read, people had a very strong reaction to it because they said this was very helpful to clean some of these words up. So that's the report that came out a few months ago. I can tell you, we have done so much more research. There's still a lot to be done, and the pace of research has slowed down greatly in the last decade. But during the 80s and 90s, we did a lot in the field. We did a lot of good research showing the impacts of various policies. And this is my short summary on incarceration. Whenever people, I said that thing about transfer, when people try to measure the impact of criminal court transfer, it ends up coming up short. There's also no real literature showing that incarceration by itself does anything to change behavior. Now that implies that the purpose of incarceration is to change behavior, and I'll dispute that in a second. We also know fairly clearly that there are lots of risks to using incarceration for young people and adults. that it's potentially toxic, harmful. People often do come out with fewer social assets, less ability to survive on their own, to resume their life, to do a job, to stay out of trouble. It actually harms futures, and so we should keep that in mind. Using incarceration for crime control has a very limited impact on public safety. That's not to say no impact. The best research looking at the crime decline, I assume all of you are aware that since the mid-1990s through today, crime has come down in this country at unprecedented rates. And right now, your probability of being the victim of a violent crime, depending on where you live. But in general, your general probability is as low as it's been since, I think we're now back to the Johnson administration. I used to say Nixon, but I think we're now back to Johnson. So very low. And compared to other countries, your probability of being a victim of any kind of crime are extremely low. The only thing that we continue to lead the world in, of course, is firearms and gun violence. But when you try to connect those trends to the expanded use of incarceration, there's a correlation. And the best kind of statistical studies you can do is controlling for the amount of explanation you get from all your variables. And when people look at the amount to which incarceration is explained or can explain changes in the crime rate, it's maybe 20%, 25%. So about a quarter of all the changes we see in the crime rate may be due to the expansion of incarceration. Because you have to remember, 30 years ago, we locked up about 300,000 people in this country. Now we lock up well over 2 million. And that's just incarceration. The expansion of the justice system overall is also impressive. The other thing we know for certain is that incarceration eats up most of your dollars. If you're trying to run a juvenile justice system and people are consuming bed space a lot, that's where all your money's going. And on a per person basis, it can be shockingly high. And finally, incarceration can capture the policy agenda, partly for all the reasons above. It's very visible. It offers the most visceral symbol of crime control that a policymaker can offer to the public. Everyone likes to see that perp walk on TV when there's been a horrendous crime. I enjoy it too. When I hear about a crime that's shocking to me, I love to hear that the person's been identified, apprehended, and we all like that feeling of safety we get. But what we don't have is a systematic overview which tells us, yes, but this person is likely to be released within so many months, and the actual act of incarcerating them may actually increase the probability that they offend again. We don't maintain all that awareness. So the challenge within juvenile justice is, how do we change that system? How do we change a system that depends on a few large institutions, funded by tax dollars, organized and operated by public agencies, and a system that's based on a theory that controlling a juvenile is the primary way of changing their behavior? And if you're probably all familiar with the concept of theory of change. If you walk into a correctional agency or a probation department or a court and you infer from watching them behave what their theory is, it's hard not to conclude that the theory is, if we can get this young person's attention, convince them that we're in charge here, they're not, that we will catch them the next time and we can change their lives for the worse at any time we want. That's usually the theory that people pursue in justice. And finally, and last two, placing youth in centralized service locations. And this is a holdover from at least the 19th century, if not before, that the way you solve crime problems is find out who the offenders are, as if there are some of us who aren't ever going to be an offender. But you find out who the offenders are and you remove them from the community, send them out. I mean, they literally did this in the 1800s. They would send kids out to a farm with this belief that exposure to agricultural life would teach them how to behave. And we are still suffering from that century-old presumption that that's the best way to go. How do we change from that to all the characteristics on the right, where we have a diverse menu of options? We have things that we can respond to a young person whose behavior may be caused by emotional disorders, family violence, trauma, mental health issues, substance abuse, but also young people whose behavior is caused by a chronic and severe case of adolescence. I think you all be reassured to know that I would say easily 50%, some of us might go up to 70%, of the young people being brought into the juvenile justice system are therefore behavior that would be explained by adolescence and all the other brain development and cognitive things that we know are happening to adolescents. They crossed a line, they've engaged in behavior that we won't accept, and our response to that behavior will determine the course of their future. But we should always remember what's going on with that 15-year-old, that 16-year-old, that's different than a 30-year-old offender or a 35-year-old. A system based on extensive private partnerships. This is a very tricky one. There's been a lot of press coverage lately about the use of for-profit prisons and all the evils they can introduce into a system. And every time I see one of these reports, I have friends that write these reports, and I say, if I could just replace the names in your report to public and replace your stories with other horror stories and easily write the same kind of advocacy statement. Can't we get beyond this public good, private bad, or private good, public bad, this simplistic binary way of thinking? Can't we start thinking about quality as a different dimension than sponsorship and financing mechanisms? And that's a very tough thing. Placing services near youth and families is also very difficult. I think we're getting better at that, but it's a key component to an effective system in the future. That instead of taking a young person away from their environment and putting them someplace that we control and providing them with all kinds of skills and assets and supportive services and then returning them home, why can't we take all those skills and assets and supportive services to them? It's just harder to do and requires all the things above. You need private partners. There would never be a state agency or a county agency that could do this kind of work. You need private providers, and not just professional reimbursement fee-for-service providers, but community groups, neighborhood groups. Someone has to leverage and organize all that work. And I sometimes, when I'm doing talks, take it upon myself and say, my profession has failed us. That used to be what social work was supposed to be. Brokering, connecting people, leveraging relationships, organizing. And we have, over the years, not all of us, prime example here in the room, keep on trying to get social workers to focus on that unique function. But we need to do a better job. So these three things. We tried to write this report characterizing, how am I doing on time? Where's Esther? We characterize the states and basic strategies into these three groups. The most traditional one, which is how we solve most governmental problems and social problems, is just resolution. We get together, we decide our new strategy, we go about implementing the new policies and the rules and let people know this is what you're expected to do in the future. And this shift from using big institutions far away from home to community-based, localized, restorative and supportive services for young people does require more diligence. The risk to resolution is that one election can undo the whole thing. And we've seen states that became national leaders in reforming juvenile justice, and literally one election, everything was thrown out and they changed tack, and all the work and all the information that developed from that is neglected from there on. So we probably need to invest in strategies that do more than that, and that's where reinvestment comes from. Now, reinvestment can be complicated because it's also the word we use for the global theory that if we reduce spending on incarceration and shift those resources to the community, we can actually improve communities. But in this context, we mean reinvestment in the smaller sense of changing the fiscal incentives that once caused states, counties, to put a lot of kids in locked facilities. And there's a history of that in the report. I think you'll hear Elizabeth Clark talk about this in a second. But it used to be, and when I say used to, I mean 10 years ago, 20 years ago, most states had a process where if you wanted to keep a young person in your local community and supervise them using probation workers, drug treatment people, it was all on you as a county. You footed the bill. On the other hand, if you wanted to send them to a big state facility and place them with the state, it was free. It didn't take, it doesn't take a researcher to tell you what the results of that kind of system will be. So we invented these reinvestment schemes to try to change those incentives, and a number of states have been doing that. Oops. And finally, realignment is, I think, probably, it's also obvious. It's as obvious as resolution. Realignment is if we don't like the way the system functions right now, let's break it down and rebuild it. I was in a meeting recently with the woman that runs Massachusetts Juvenile Justice, and we were talking about this, and she said, but you don't want to undo the whole system. And I said to her, well, in your mind, yes, you want to just basically wipe that slate clean and say, if I were in charge of this and my 14-year-old was about to be arrested and go into the system, how would I build it? So use that as perhaps a mental experiment, but think about how you would build it. And let's not have all these presumptions, well, we have to use this program because they've been here for 40 years, and this is just how we do things. How would you really build it? And realignment is a strategy being used in California and also Wayne County, which has actually resulted in dramatic changes. And there are downsides, and we can talk about that some. Why is this happening now? Why all this talk? Chico referred to this a minute ago. Crime is way down. both among juveniles and young adults. Placements are way down. The dark line on top is the number of youth in public facilities in 2000 and then declining until the year 2008. And those are the state lines. Obviously you can't read that, but it's in the report. And that line right there is the negative drop, or the drop in Michigan numbers, which I think from 2000 to 2008, placements in public facilities in Michigan dropped, looks like maybe 27, 28%. But it's all over the country with a few exceptions. So the question is why? Why are we dropping the use of incarceration now, and why do we use it so much before? And I think you have to accept these. Incapacitation is the word criminologists and social scientists use to mean sometimes we lock people up just so that we lock them up. We're not looking for behavior change, we're not looking for treatment, I just want this person off the street. We're not supposed to admit that in juvenile justice, but you go into a courtroom and talk to prosecutors and police officers, it doesn't take long to realize that that is part of juvenile justice. We do things just to get the kid off the street. And sometimes we say it's for their own good, but we do that. Retribution is the term we use for, we get you locked up because you deserve it. We're also not supposed to admit to that in juvenile justice. It's not in many state codes. We instead use the softer, more acceptable term, accountability. But it's basically, we're going to lock you up because this kid deserves it. And the last two, convenience. I think the reason the large training school model, institutional model, has survived for so long, it's easier to manage. That thing I mentioned about all the partners and community groups and neighborhoods, that's a lot of work. And that's why people don't do it. It's just easier to build one place, send them there, maybe two, maybe three. And then you have all those economies of scale. It's hard to argue, like, if you need to provide education, mental health services, and dentistry to 500 youthful offenders, it's a lot easier to do that in one place. And I think, maybe we don't want to admit that, but we do that just because it's easier. And the last one is a fancier term, isomorphism, which means we just do this because this is what other people do. Other states do it like this, we're going to do it like this. The juvenile court itself sort of spread across the country in about 20 years, partly because people heard about it. That sounds like a good idea. Let's get that bill, find the bill that Kansas just used, let's rewrite that and we'll pass it too. None of these things are going to change. Economies of scale, the impulse to incapacitate, to exact retribution, this is not going to change. So the big question is, what happens, all these great reforms are happening right now, what if the environment changes? What if crime rates are bottoming out, but they start to come back up? What if we experience a rise in youth crime like the one we saw from the 80s into the mid-90s? Who would argue with me that politics have permanently changed around juvenile justice? I think the greatest risk is if crime rates come back up, we're going to go right back into the same fight we were in before. And the other factor is money. Everyone cross their fingers and pray to whatever you want to pray to, that the money situation changes, that we have public budgets increasing and tax rolls increasing. What if those two things happen at the same time? Crime goes up, money starts flowing again. I don't see any reason to believe that we've changed juvenile justice permanently just because all these reforms are happening. These are all the examples in the report that we go into. If you can't read those in the back, they're just names for different states who've done interesting things within a reinvestment approach, a resolution approach, or a realignment approach. And I want to focus on a couple of those just as a note of caution. Reclaim Ohio is probably one of the more well-known reinvestment strategies. Ohio basically decided to start charging counties differently for using incarceration versus community services. And this is all encouraging. The dark line is the number of juvenile commitments to the Ohio Department of Youth Services from 1997 to 2010. And there's a precipitous decline there. The concern is the decline is not uniform and consistent. And if you look right there, the light blue line, the turquoise line, is the violent juvenile crime arrest rate in Ohio. And like a lot of states, Ohio saw a slight increase, an uptick from 2004 to 2006 in violent crime. And if you remember that, there was a lot of press attention and conversation about that uptick. Some, like the Police Executive Research Forum put out a report called The Gathering Storm. We were starting to see this brand new wave of scare tactics and the same kind of stuff we've been through for the last 20 years. And when the crime rate started to come up in Ohio, look what happened to the commitments in Ohio. They flattened out. You can just see that the whole system reacted by saying, uh-oh. And then when the crime rate peaked again and started coming down, the commitments started coming down. The point is that It's possible that all these successes we've been crowing about in juvenile justice about reducing incarceration is simply a function of lower pressure and fewer resources.